Hello and welcome to Dagon. Now, this is supposed to be like a recreation of a H.P. Lovecraft story, I think, maybe. Dagon is a faithful interactive adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's work focused on story and atmosphere. You will not find difficult choices, action sequences, or inventory management here, and movement is limited to progressing through locations along with the plot.
I am writing this under an appreciable mental strain, since by tonight I shall be no more.
During the game, you'll encounter interactive elements. Some of them will allow you to continue your journey, others reveal interesting facts about the original short story. Sorry, I just cracked my knuckle. Its historical background and the author. Some of the trivia is hidden. In order to find these secrets, focus your eyes and look for the Elder Sign. You can also access all the found facts later. They will be available in the main menu. Okay.
Penniless, and at the end of my supply of the drug which alone makes life endurable, I can bear the torture no longer, and shall cast myself from this garret window into the squalid street below.
Alright then.
Do not think from my slavery to morphine that I am a weakling or a degenerate. When you have read these hastily scrawled pages, you may guess, though never fully realize, why it is that I must have forgetfulness or death.
Well. Morphine. Morphine entered into use in the 19th century and was routinely administered to treat severe pain during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, and in World War I, 1914 to 1918. It was also sold without restrictions until 1914. Morphine became more popular after the invention of hypodermic syringe around 1854. Frederick Stirner, who first isolated the substance, originally named it morphidium after Morpheus, the Greek god associated with dreams. At the time when Dagon was published, morphine abuse, known as soldier's disease, was already posed a big problem in the United States. Very interesting. Morphine is also a bit deadly, given the dose.
One of the most open and least frequented parts of the broad Pacific, that the packet of which I was supercargo fell a victim to the German sea raider.
Alright. Well, Lovecraft and the Great War. Dagon was written around a month after the United States entered World War I. Lovecraft was actively interested in its course. He composed many poems in which he gave encouragement to soldiers and commented on the events unfolding in Europe. He had tried to enlist in the army, which he mentions in one of the letters to Reinhard Kienler. Some time ago, impressed by my entire uselessness in the world, I resolved to attempt enlistment despite my almost invalid condition. I argued that if I chose a regiment soon to depart for France, my sheer nervous force, which is not inconsiderable, must sustain me till a bullet or a piece of shrapnel could more conclusively and effectively dispose of me. Letters to Reinhard Kleiner, H.P. Lovecraft. But even though he passed the physical exam, his mother prevented him from going to the war. She has threatened me to go to any lengths, legal or otherwise, if I do not reveal all the ills which unfit me for the war. I am Providence, the life and times of H.P. Lovecraft. S.T. Josh. Well, it's interesting. I don't know much about Lovecraft, if I want to be honest.
The Great War was then at its very beginning, and the ocean forces of the Hun had not completely sunk to their later degradation, so that our vessel was made a legitimate prize, whilst we of her crew were treated with all the fairness and consideration due us as naval prisoners.
The Huns. The Huns were Central Asian nomads who established a dominion in Europe and invaded the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD. They were known as brutal, deadly warriors and masters of quick raids who also developed powerful composite bows, lassos, and early siege weapons. During World War I, the British used the word Hun as a synonym for Germans in order to emphasize their brutality. However, the term originated when the German Emperor Wilhelm II gave a speech to his troops on 27th of July 1900 before they embarked to China. Should you encounter the enemy, he will not be defeated. No quarter will be given. Prisoners will not be taken. Whoever falls into your hands is forfeited, just as a thousand years ago, the Huns under the King Attila made a name for themselves, one that even today marks them seem mighty in history and legend. May the name German be affirmed by you in such a way in China that no Chinese will ever again dare to look cross-eyed at a German. The refusal to take prisoners was a clear breach of the laws and customs of war adopted during the First Hague Convention of 1899. Well, it's unfortunate, I suppose.
So liberal, indeed, was the discipline of our captors, that 5 days after we were taken, I managed to escape alone, in a small boat, with water and provisions for a good length of time.
I might have missed something there, actually.
When I finally found myself adrift and free, I had but little idea of my surroundings. Never a competent navigator, I could only guess vaguely by the sun and stars that I was somewhat south of the equator. Of the longitude, I knew nothing, and no island or coastline was in sight.
Well, it's a bit unfortunate. See if there's anything here first.
The weather kept fair, and for uncounted days I drifted aimlessly beneath the scorching sun, waiting either for some passing ship or to be cast on the shores of some habitable land.
Well, I don't know if this was the best idea, but I guess it's better than getting killed, maybe. I don't know. The Return to Short Stories. Dagon was written in July 1917 and first published in 1919 in the Vagrant. I don't know how to pronounce things. An amateur magazine focused on the supernatural. The story is the first of his stories that introduced an element from the Cthulhu mythos, Dagon itself. A pagan cult worshipping Dagon later appears in the shadow over Innsmouth, I think, one of Lovecraft's most popular works. 1917 is also the year when he wrote The Tomb, a story about Jervis Dudley, a daydreamer who discovers a mysterious mausoleum in the woods by his house and becomes obsessed with it. These two marked Lovecraft's return to short story writing after he burned most of his attempts at the genre 9 years prior and decided to concentrate on poetry. Lovecraft stated that it was his friend William Paul Cook, a literary publisher and critic, who convinced him to start writing weird fiction again.
But neither ship nor land appeared, and I began to despair in my solitude upon the heaving vastness of unbroken blue. The change happened whilst I slept. Its details I shall never know, for my slumber, though troubled and dream-infested, was continuous.
Oh, great. Giant cephalopods. You know, I just wonder what was going through Lovecraft's mind when he decided to write about giant cephalopods. Not that I'm saying anything about them, but I mean, just curious to know what caused them to write about giant cephalopods.
When at last I awoke, it was to discover myself half sucked into a slimy expanse of hellish black mire, which extended about me in monotonous undulations as far as I could see, and in which my boat lay grounded some distance away. Though one might well imagine that my first sensation would be of wonder at so prodigious and unexpected a transformation of scenery, I was in reality more horrified than astonished. For there was in the air, and in the rotting soil, a sinister quality which chilled me to the very core. The region was putrid with the carcasses of decaying fish, and of other, less describable things which I saw protruding from the nasty mud of the unending plain. Perhaps I should not hope to convey in mere words the unutterable hideousness that can dwell in absolute silence and barren immensity. There was nothing within hearing, and nothing in sight, save a vast reach of black slime. Yet the very completeness of the stillness and the homogeneity of the landscape oppressed me with a nauseating fear. The sun was blazing down from a sky which seemed to me almost black in its cloudless cruelty, as though reflecting the inky marsh beneath my feet.
Well, this is weird. The origins of Dagon. Dagon seems to be inspired by Fish Head, a short novel by Ivan S. Kobe about unnatural affinities between a hybrid idiot and a strange fish of an isolated lake, supernatural horror in literature, H.P. Lovecraft, and Lovecraft's dream about a strange island emerging from an ocean had him crawling in the ooze that covered the surface. I dreamed of that whole hideous crawl and can yet feel the ooze sucking me down. A Dispense of Dagon, H.P. Lovecraft. Lovecraft's interest in the topic stemmed from his aversion to fish and sea smells. In his own words, I have hated fish and feared the sea and everything connected with it since I was 2 years old, but I cannot recall what earlier experience gave me such a profound and lasting aversion to sea and seafood. The Dweller in Darkness, Lovecraft, 1927, Donald Wandre. I think a lot of people have a fear of the sea. It's not exactly uncommon, but...
As I crawled into the stranded boat, I realized that only one theory could explain my position. Through some unprecedented volcanic upheaval, a portion of the ocean floor must have been thrown to the surface, exposing regions for which innumerable millions of years had lain hidden under unfathomable watery depths. So great was the extent of the new land which had risen beneath me that I could not detect the faintest noise of the surging ocean, straining my ears as I might. Nor were there any seafowl to prey upon the dead things.
Well... what is that pulsating thing in the background, and why is it pulsating?
For several hours I sat thinking or brooding in the boat, which lay upon its side and afforded a slight shade as the sun moved across the heavens. As the day progressed, the ground lost some of its stickiness and seemed likely to dry sufficiently for traveling purposes in a short time. That night I slept but little, and the next day I made for myself a pack containing food and water, preparatory to an overland journey in search of the vanished sea and possible rescue.
Oh, hello there. How are you doing? Good? That's good. Maybe don't eat me.
On the third morning, I found the soil dry enough to walk upon with ease. The odor of the fish was maddening, but I was too much concerned with graver things to mind so slight an evil, and set out boldly for an unknown goal.
Alright, well... I guess we just gotta go.
All day I forged steadily westward, guided by a faraway hummock which rose higher than any other elevation on the rolling desert.
Well, I don't know what to make of this. Am I dreaming? Is this real? Is this imagination?
That night, I encamped, and on the following day still travelled toward the hummock, though that object seemed scarcely nearer than when I had first espied it.
The Horrors of the Ocean. The creator of Cthulhu mythos and the fictional underwater city of Valais was convinced that the life could not exist at the bottom of the ocean because the water pressure would make it uninhabitable. Say that to Andrew Ryan. Today we know that the darkest depths of the ocean are home to many peculiar organisms. The deepest dwelling fish we have discovered so far, the Mariana snailfish, can live about 8,000 meters, more than 26,000 feet, below the ocean's surface in never-ending darkness and at crushing pressures, hundreds of times stronger than those found at sea level. Upon glancing at the modern photos of deep-sea creatures such as the anglerfish, the fangtooth, or the viperfish, and their truly Lovecraftian characteristics, it's not hard to find some irony in this. Deep-sea creatures are pretty odd, though the way that they work and survive under the pressure is pretty cool.
By the fourth evening, I attained the base of the mound, which turned out to be much higher than it had appeared from a distance, an intervening valley setting it out in sharper relief from the general surface. Too weary to ascend, I slept in the shadow of the hill. I know not why my dreams were so wild that night, but ere the waning and fantastically gibbous moon had risen far above the eastern plain, I was awake in a cold perspiration, determined to sleep no more. Such visions as I had experienced were too much for me to endure again, and in the glow of the moon I saw how unwise I had been to travel by day. Without the glare of the parching sun, my journey would have cost me less energy. Indeed, I now felt quite able to perform the ascent which had deterred me at sunset. Picking up my pack, I started for the crest of the eminence.
Alright, well, let's go. Oh wait, here we go. The Loner. Contrary to popular opinion, Lovecraft was not an ever-frowning, eccentric, grumpy loner. He was considered himself to be a person who appreciated humor. Moreover, he would often meet with friends in his apartment or at various cafes in Brooklyn and Manhattan. At times, his social life was so intensive, his work would suffer for months. There was a point when he finally decided he needed to put an end to daily meetings and loitering in New York cafeterias, and resorted to hiding at home and reading with the main room light turned off. Pretending he wasn't there whenever a friend knocked on his door, he had also another method of deterring his guests, which involved greeting them in a bathrobe, with an unmade bed visible in the background and piles of papers scattered across the floor. Interesting.
I have said that the unbroken monotony of the rolling plain was a source of vague horror to me, but I think my horror was greater when I gained the summit of the mound and looked down the other side into an immeasurable pit or canyon, whose black recesses the moon had not yet soared high enough to illumine. I felt myself on the edge of the world, peering over the rim into a fathomless chaos of eternal night. Through my terror ran curious reminiscences of Paradise Lost, and of Satan's hideous climb through the unfashioned realms of darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, I began to see that the slopes of the valley were not quite so perpendicular as I had imagined.
Well, let's hope that I don't end up falling.
Ledges and outcroppings of rock afforded fairly easy footholds for a descent, whilst after a drop of only a few hundred feet, the declivity became very gradual.
Well, here we go. I don't know where I am, man.
Urged on by an impulse which I cannot definitely analyze, scrambled with difficulty down the rocks and stood on the gentler slope beneath, gazing into the Stygian deeps where no light had yet penetrated. All at once, my attention was captured by a vast and singular object on the opposite slope, which rose steeply about 100 yards ahead of me. An object that gleamed whitely in the newly bestowed rays of the ascending moon.
I mean, I don't know if I should trust it, that's the thing.
That it was merely a gigantic piece of stone, I soon assured myself, but I was conscious of a distinct impression that its contour and position were not altogether the work of nature. A closer scrutiny filled me with sensations I cannot express.
I mean, I don't know, man. You know, there's the bunch of, like...
For despite its enormous magnitude, and its position in an abyss which had yawned at the bottom of the sea since the world was young, I perceived beyond a doubt that the strange object was a well-shaped monolith, whose massive bulk had known the workmanship and perhaps the worship of living and thinking creatures. Dazed and frightened, yet not without a certain thrill of the scientist's or archaeologist's delight, I examined my surroundings more closely.
So... sentient worshipping cephalopods? Maybe?
The moon, now near the zenith, shone weirdly and vividly above the towering steeps that hemmed in the chasm, and revealed the fact that a far-flung body of water flowed at the bottom, winding out of sight in both directions, and almost lapping my feet as I stood on the slope. Across the chasm, the wavelets washed the base of the cyclopean monolith, on whose surface I could now trace both inscriptions and crude sculptures.
I don't know, man. I don't know about this.
The writing was in a system of hieroglyphics unknown to me and unlike anything I'd ever seen in books, consisting for the most part of conventionalized aquatic symbols such as fishes, eels, octopi, crustaceans, mollusks, whales, and the like.
Octopuses, thank you very much. Sorry, just... You know, when you're really passionate about cephalopods, you just gotta call people out like that.
Several characters obviously represented marine things which are unknown to the modern world, but whose decomposing forms I had observed on the ocean-risen plain. It was the pictorial carving, however, that did most to hold me spellbound.
Sort of Cthulhu. Storytelling methods. Dagon contains many themes and storytelling methods that Lovecraft developed in his later works, such as telling the story through carvings at the Mountains of Madness, the Nameless City, journals and character notes, The Shadow of Out of Time, The Haunter of the Dream, The Dark, islands emerging from the ocean, the Call of Cthulhu, or fictional beings and deities based on real events and mythologies, Mago and the Whisper and Darkness. It's also considered the origin of the popular Cthulhu mythos. Some of Lovecraft's other stories also conclude in a manner similar to Dagon, but let's skip the details in order not to spoil the ending. Very well.
Plainly visible across the intervening water, on account of their enormous size, were an array of bas-reliefs whose subjects would have excited the envy of a Doré. I think that these things were supposed to depict men, at least a certain sort of men, though the creatures were shown disporting like fishes in the waters of some marine grotto, or paying homage at some monolithic shrine which appeared to be under the waves as well. Of their faces and forms I dare not speak in detail, for the mere remembrance makes me grow faint, grotesque beyond the imagination of a Poe or a Bulwer. They were damnably human in general outline, despite webbed hands and feet, shockingly wide and flabby lips, glassy, bulging eyes, and other features less pleasant to recall. Curious Curiously enough, they seem to have been chiseled badly out of proportion with their scenic background. For one of the creatures was shown in the act of killing a whale, represented as but little larger than himself. I remarked, as I say, their grotesqueness and strange size, but in a moment decided that they were merely the imaginary gods of some primitive fishing or seafaring tribe. Some tribe whose last descendant had perished eras before the first ancestor of the Piltdown or Neanderthal man was born.
I'm gonna somehow doubt that. The Piltdown man? Question mark? I think that's how you pronounce it. Lovecraft would often use the latest scientific discoveries as inspiration for his works. He could even update his stories at the last moment in order to make sure they reflected the latest breakthroughs. Fortunately, this method was not without its flaws. After Lovecraft's death, the Piltdown man discovery mentioned in Dagon turned out to be a paleoanthropologic fraud. In 1912, Charles Dawson, an amateur archaeologist, announced that he had discovered the missing link between ape and man, the fossilized remains of a previously unknown early human. Years later, they turned out to be forgery, but by that point, the fraud had already managed to negatively affect the early research on human evolution. In the year when the discovery took place, the majority of the scientific community believed Dawson indeed found the missing link. In 1953, the Time magazine published evidence providing that Dawson was a con man. It turned out to be that the fossils of the previously unknown early human consisted of a human skull, the jaw of an orangutan, and chimpanzee teeth. Yeah, people will do anything for scientific
Awestruck at this
scams.
unexpected glimpse into a past beyond the conception of the most daring anthropologist, I stood musing whilst the moon cast queer reflections on the silent channel before me. Then, suddenly, I saw it. With only a slight churning to mark its rise to the surface, the thing slid into view above the dark waters. Loathsome, it darted like a stupendous monster of nightmares to the monolith, about which it flung its gigantic scaly arms, while it bowed its hideous head and gave vent to certain measured sounds. I think I went mad then. Of my frantic ascent of the sloping cliff, and of my delirious journey back to the stranded boat, I remember little.
Alright, well, time to go. I'll be honest, that scared me. I wasn't expecting that.
I believe I sang a great deal and laughed oddly when I was unable to sing.
Alright, let's go.
I have indistinct recollections of a great storm sometime after I reached the boat. At any rate, I know that I heard pearls of thunder and other tones which nature utters only in her wildest moods. When I came out of the shadows, I was in a San Francisco hospital, brought thither by the captain of the American ship which had picked up my boat in mid-ocean. In my delirium, I had said much, but found that my words had been given scant attention. Of any land upheaval in the Pacific, my rescuers knew nothing, nor did I deem it necessary to insist upon a thing which I knew they could not believe.
So we may or may not be crazy to other people, but hey. It happened, I guess. The journalist. Lovecraft was a prominent figure in the world of amateur journalism. In 1915, he started publishing his own journal called The Conservative, which included political and social commentary, poetry, short stories, and literary criticism written by him and other authors. Howard was a skilled wordsmith, but he also took criticisms to heart, which resulted in his decision to step away from writing poetry and concentrate on weird fiction again, for the first time since his teenage years. Dagon was published in 1917. One of his is one of his short stories written during that period. In this example excerpt from The Conservative, the master of horror fiction explains his attitude towards warfare and the idea of world peace. With any sane human being can believe in the possibility of universal peace is more than the conservative can fathom. Should the entire civilized world agree simultaneously to disarm, one or more nations would undoubtedly retain secret armaments and at the proper time take advantage of one of their more altruistic and less astute contemporaries in a world career of conquest against unarmed victims. No country is or can ever be above warfare until the basic impulses of human animals shall have miraculously changed.
Once I sought out a celebrated ethnologist and amused him with peculiar questions regarding the ancient Philistine legend of Dagon, the fish god.
So, are we crazy, or... I mean, I have a feeling that we might not be crazy. Dagon was the main deity of the Philistines, worshipped throughout the Middle East as the ancient god of fertility and crops. In Hebrew, the word Dagon was a common noun for grain. The rulers of Akkad, Mesopotamia, chose him as the patron saint of their war conquest. He also appeared as the judge of the dead in the Assyrian poem and an underworld prison warder in one of the Babylonian texts. He is often mistakenly taken for a fish god due to the wrong interpretation of his name, as in Hebrew the word dag means fish. In H.P. Lovecraft's works, Dagon is an underwater deity ruling over the deep ones, a humanoid race with fish traits that reside in the oceans. He is worshipped by a secret cult named the Historic Order of Dagon.
But soon perceiving that he was hopelessly conventional, I did not press my inquiries.
August Derleth and the Cthulhu Mythos. August Derleth was an American writer and anthologist. He has also befriended Lovecraft and published many of his works through his company, Arkham House. Although he greatly contributed to the popularization of the author's works after his death, he is surrounded by numerous controversies. One of his most questionable decisions involved introducing the good versus evil doctrine. Derleth was a devout Catholic to the Cthulhu mythos, which contrasted with Lovecraft's view of the world and his approach to cosmic horror. As a result, author's works are quite often misunderstood and misrepresented in today's culture. It's also worth noting that Lovecraft was never really interested in creating a mythology, and the term Cthulhu mythos was coined by Derleth after the author left the mortal plane. Interesting. Whoops, what was that? The camera does this weird thing when you turn it around fully. Like, snaps back to his original position. Which is fine, but it's a little off-putting when it first happens.
It is at night, especially when the moon is gibbous and waning, that I see the thing. I tried morphine, but the drug has given only transient surcease, and has drawn me into its clutches as a hopeless slave. So now I am to end it all, having written a full account for the information or the contemptuous amusement of my fellow men.
Oh boy. Lovecraft on tobacco and alcohol. Lovecraft hated tobacco, even though he used to smoke when he was 12 in order to look and feel like an adult. In his correspondence with friend Reinhard Kleiner, he claims that he quit as soon as he started wearing long pants. He had also a very strong opinion about alcohol, as evidenced by his letter to Zelia Brown dated 13th of February 1928. As for the matter of drinking, I've never tasted intoxicating liquor and never intend to, having a strong aesthetic disgust at anything which blunts or coarsens. That's the word. Good gosh. The delicate nature of equipoise and evolved human intellect and imagination. Drinking excited my personal preponderance. Hence, I don't drink. Let the herd do what they will. I am rather in favor of prohibition. The prohibition of any one antisocial force, as well as of any other. Source: The Spirit of Revision, Lovecraft's Letters to Zelia Brown, Reed Bishop, H.P. Lovecraft, Sean Burney, and Andrew Lehman, S.T. Joshi. Very well. I'm not very good at pronouncing things, apparently.
Often, I ask myself if it could not all have been a pure phantasm, a mere freak of fever, as I lay sun-stricken and raving in the open boat after my escape from the German man-of-war. This I ask myself, but ever does there come before me a hideously vivid vision in reply. I cannot think of the deep sea without shuddering at the nameless things that may at this very moment be crawling and floundering on its slimy bed, worshipping their ancient stone idols and carving their own detestable likenesses on submarine obelisks of water-soaked granite. I dream of a day when they may rise above the billows to drag down into their reeking talons the remnants of puny, war-exhausted mankind. Of a day when the land shall sink and the dark ocean shall ascend amidst universal pandemonium.
Well, this doesn't look good.
The end is near. I hear a noise at the door, as of some immense slippery body lumbering against it.
Hello. Just trying to look out for any other notes and stuff. Alright, let's see who's at the door.
God, that hand! The window! The window!
Alright. Here we go. Thank you for playing. We hope you enjoyed immersing yourself into our little pool of cosmic horror. We would appreciate it if you took a moment to rate Dagon and check out our other games and DLCs. So that was pretty interesting. Kind of gave me Amnesia vibes, sort of. I think this was a pretty interesting little recreation of one of Lovecraft's stories, and I really enjoyed it. I can tell, I mean, I know they tell you, but you can tell that Lovecraft sort of has a fear of the sea, which I'm sure is a fear that many people share, but I don't know. Anyway, this was really cool. It's also free, which is really nice too. They have other DLCs, which I'm sure is just as good, and is also a way to support them. And they also have other games, of course. But that was Dagon, a nice little recreation of an H.P. Lovecraft story, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.